Persona 3 Reload is a game I have a lot of mixed feelings about. While I would never call it a bad game looking at it in a vacuum, as a remake of Persona 3, I think it fails more often than it succeeds. I've had a rough history with the original Persona 3. I got into the series with Persona 5, and then played the games backwards from that point. While Persona 4 was easy for me to get into, I had a hard time adjusting to Persona 3's unique gameplay quirks. The game infamously uses an AI-controlled party instead of having direct commands, and while that might seem like a pretty small change on paper, it drastically changes how you need to approach battles and dungeon exploration. Since it was so different from the other two games I had already played, I didn't feel the need to actually learn the new quirks that came with the mechanical shift, which led to a lot of frustration as I got further and further into the game and kept dying to things seemingly outside of my control. Eventually, I would slowly learn the ins and outs of the tactics system, such as how to change the skill priority and planning a couple steps ahead in battle. And now that I've learned to play by the game's rules, I really adore what it sets out to do. While I do prefer direct commands overall, the tactics system offers such a unique way of approaching battles that I think the game overall benefits from their inclusion, and the result is a gameplay experience I've rarely found anywhere else. So when Persona 3 Reload came out earlier this year, I was disappointed to see just how much was changed for the worse during the transition to modern hardware. For every new thing I like, such as the new English voice cast and the new music, there's just as much about the game that frustrates me to no end. Instead of adapting the original game's unique mechanics into a modern lens, more often than not these mechanics are outright dropped, and replaced with something that dumbs down the game to a monotonous degree. They didn't even bother to make a competent tactics system for the people who'd prefer to use it. In fact, they somehow made it worse than its implementation in previous games, since while being controlled by the AI, party members just straight up won't use some of the game's mechanics. While the story is pretty much the same as the original, there's a lot of artistic and directorial changes that I think diminish its overall impact. I find that a majority of the changes often fly in the face or downplay the intentions of the original game, which is really frustrating to see in a remake of a game I adore, and one that's sold as the definitive version of Persona 3. About a month after launch, they announced that the epilogue The Answer from Persona 3 FES would be added as post-launch DLC. A lot of people were upset that this wasn't going to be included leading up to the launch of the base game, since it's pretty important to some of the spin-offs and a nice send-off to the game's cast. So it was nice to see that it was going to be included after all, even if it was as paid DLC. But you know, I think I've had my fill of Reload at this point, and I wasn't really blown away by the original version of The Answer to begin with, so I think I'm gonna skip out on this one. Wait, is that fucking Joker? The original version of The Answer is pretty infamous among Persona fans. It's a little tedious since its main focus is dungeon crawling without any of the social sim stuff to alleviate the monotony. The story is also a little contrived in some places, which turns off some people despite how important it is in the greater context of the series. While this new version does improve on a few aspects, it doesn't really do a whole lot to alleviate any of my issues from the base version of Reload. In fact, I'll argue that this DLC is the perfect encapsulation of all of my issues with the remake in one nice little package. So I'm going to break down my issues with both the gameplay and the story, and hopefully highlight why I think Reload as a whole fails as a remake of Persona 3. Also, I know this DLC is still pretty new, and likely a lot of people's first experience with the campaign, so consider this your spoiler warning for both Reload and The Answer. With that out of the way, let's discuss why episode Aigis isn't the answer I was hoping for. The Answer picks up on March 31st, 2009, a few weeks after the main game ends, with the Seize members meeting one final time to return their equipment before the dorm closes. It's pretty clear that there's a disconnect between the members after Makoto's death. Some members don't even show up to the dorm's closing, and among the ones that do, there's this lingering sense of tension around their interactions. The remaining members decide to throw a party as sort of a last hurrah, but once the clock strikes midnight, they find that the day has seemingly reset back to March 31st. Not thinking much of it at first, Aigis decides to go up to her room, but is quickly woken up by Fuka saying there's a commotion downstairs. Upon arriving, they find another shadow weapon like Aigis attacking the other C's members and making quick work of them. In a state of panic, Aigis summons her persona to stop the attacker, when it suddenly transforms into Orpheus, which was Makoto's persona. After stopping the attacker, Aigis passes out, and when she wakes up, she finds that she's covered in a bunch of new combat gear, and that the rest of the C's members have shown up at the dorm. The rest of the group tells her that they've been trapped inside, and that time seems to be looping every time the clock strikes midnight. The mysterious robot introduces herself as Metis, and claims to be Aigis' sister. Metis tells the group that an area known as the Abyss of Time has formed under the dorm, and with very little else to go off of, they decide to explore it in search of provisions and a way to escape. From here, you'll quickly get accustomed to this DLC's gameplay loop. You'll explore a section of the Abyss of Time until you reach the bottom, get a couple of cutscenes, and repeat the process for each of the 7 blocks. The Abyss of Time is set up in a similar way to Tartarus, only instead of progressing upwards, you go down instead. One immediate improvement this version has over the original is that it features the Persona Compendium. For whatever reason, the original version didn't have one, which made Persona Fusion less fun, since you were incentivized to not experiment with fusion chains, since messing up or getting a fusion accident would force you to grind to get that persona back. Now that it's here, you're able to more freely experiment with fusion like in the base game, which I think is better, especially since this expansion is so gameplay heavy. You can also transfer your compendium from a base game save, which I'm not really a fan of, I'm not gonna lie. A big part of the Persona gameplay loop is fusing new personas and passing skills between them to make the best kit. And while you can only summon a persona from the base game compendium once you're at its level, it still takes away a key part of the gameplay loop if you can just summon a guy that has all the work already done for you. Admittedly, I wasn't able to use this feature because I played on the hardest Heartless difficulty, which doesn't let you carry over your compendium. But really, I guess it doesn't matter, because this game was a cakewalk regardless. I was hoping that with the feedback of the base game they'd be able to address at least a few of the issues I had with it, but unfortunately every single one of them is still present here, and in some cases they've actually gotten worse. The original version of the answer is notorious for its difficulty. The game certainly doesn't pull its punches. It assumes you already have a pretty good grasp on the game's mechanics and isn't afraid to test you on them. A lot of bosses will force you to experiment with different party combinations, through having complementary skill sets, a variety of different elements, and unique skills that help them evade their weaknesses. It's been a while since I've played the original game, and while I remember it being pretty hard, I don't remember struggling all that much. The game definitely dragged a little bit towards the end, but overall I found the difficulty to be quite fair and satisfying. In interviews leading up to the DLC's release, the producer talks about how fine-tuning the difficulty was a big goal for the team, so that it wasn't as frustrating as the original. So I guess by fine-tuning, what they really meant was removing any substance the game had whatsoever. I guess we'll start with some of the new issues this DLC introduces. There's a lot of stuff in this game that's left up to chance when it really shouldn't be. For example, every character starts out with their basic theurgies, which are basically super moves unique to each character, and you unlock their second tier ones at random times throughout the game. As far as I'm aware, there's no indication or anything that you can unlock them. They just randomly happen sometimes when you go back to the dorm from the Abyss of Time. This would be strange on its own, but it's made worse by the fact that the game incentivizes you to go back to the dorm as little as possible. See, this game has the major tarot card system like the base game does. Basically, if you pick a major tarot card during shuffle time, you'll get a permanent buff until you stop exploring. But since there's only one day in the DLC, they now reset whenever you return to the dorm. Because of this, you're incentivized to not go back to the dorm so that you can keep your bonuses for as long as possible. The only thing you really gain from going back upstairs is a health refill, but there's so many other ways to do that through things like the clock in the lobby or through shuffle time, that there's hardly a reason to go upstairs unless the game forces you to. You could argue that having the theurgies unlocked this way is an incentive to go back upstairs more frequently, but there's no indication or consistency to when these unlock events happen, and because it's already so easy to heal, you risk wasting any major tarot cards you have just at the chance of getting an upgrade. Not only are these events occurring at all random, but the order you get the theurgies in seems to be random too. I was playing through this DLC alongside a couple of friends, and we kept wondering when we were going to get Ken's second theurgy, since it's arguably the best one in the game. I got mine in the middle of exploring the 4th block, but one of my other friends didn't get it on his Ken until the end of the 6th one. I tried looking at a guide to see if there was any sort of pattern to when they unlocked, and according to the one I looked at, they unlocked after progressing to a certain point in every area, but after cross-referencing my notes, I found that I unlocked most of them before the points listed in the guide. I hope I'm making sense, because this shit is making my head hurt just thinking about it. I don't understand the rationale behind making character progression random like this. It's not like I was really struggling without these abilities or anything, but it's frustrating to be presented with these upgrades and then not be told why or how these things are unlocking, and just be expected to roll with it, especially when the game goes out of its way to encourage you to not do the action that unlocks them in the first place. Another bit of RNG in this DLC that really frustrates me has to do with the enemy turn order. For some reason, enemies will just randomly go multiple times in a row. This didn't happen in the base game. There's no pop-up or anything telling you about it, it'll just happen sometimes. I think it has something to do with the agility stat, because I tried fighting the Reaper, one of the super bosses in this game, severely underleveled, and he would get like 4 turns before I could move once. And I also noticed this happened less and less the further I got into the game. But I don't think this should even be a thing that can happen in the first place. The One More combat system is heavily centered around the distribution of turns between you and the enemy. Just about everything from buffs, debuffs, and status ailments are rooted in the amount of turns that have passed. So giving enemies a way to bypass those set rules and just go multiple times in a row without striking a weakness or something is frustrating, because it means stuff like status ailments will wear off earlier than they're supposed to. It makes strategizing around these things harder than it should be, because it's completely out of the player's control. It goes against everything that's been done with the One More system since Persona 3. It's not a fair change, it just feels cheap and frustrating, especially since the game just doesn't tell you about it. By far my biggest issue with episode Aigis is how much it doubles down on the issues that plagued base Reload. In a lot of ways, this DLC is a speedrun of everything I hate about the changes made to the battle system. Persona games have been slowly getting easier as time goes on, but what really makes Reload stand out to me is that they not only make the player extremely powerful, but they also take away most, if not all, meaningful decision making as the game progresses. Just about every upgrade you get in this game takes something away from the gameplay loop. Don't want to position yourself behind an enemy in order to get an ambush? Just use the ambush dash to not only guarantee an ambush from any direction, but also inflict a status ailment in the process. Don't want to bother planning out a fusion chain to get the most powerful skills on a persona? Just use a bunch of skill cards that can be easily duplicated with a farmable resource. Don't want to use the Twilight Fragments to heal your party at the cost of missing out on some locked chests? Just wait for Fuka to use her theurgy, or to get a free heal from a Shuffle Time card. Don't want to bother coming up with a strategy to fight a boss that has a bunch of resistances and strong skills? Just spam theurgies for free big dick damage until it dies. Don't want to wait until you're the proper level to fuse a busted persona? Just get the Sun Tarot card that lets you fuse 5 levels above you at no extra cost. Every single upgrade you get in this game takes away some amount of decision making from the player. Instead of adding new strategic options or way to approach a situation, they just let you skip anything and everything that could add nuance to the gameplay with little to no resistance. Despite playing on the hardest difficulty, I was on autopilot for most of this DLC. The only times I died were when I either stopped paying attention or accidentally killed myself trying to attack an enemy. It's extremely easy to make yourself super powerful without even trying. The Monad doors return in this DLC, this time offering 3 different difficulties to choose from, with the quality of rewards increasing with each difficulty. The equipment you get from these doors will have random effects attached to them, and they're kind of ridiculous. For example, about halfway through the game, I got a piece of armor on Aigis that gave her auto concentrate, which doubles her first magic attack at the start of battle at no SP cost. If these Monad battles were actually difficult, that would be one thing, but they're all about as easy as the standard enemies, just with higher HP pools, so the rewards don't exactly match the effort that's required to get them. So despite the game not being very difficult, this was still one of the most tedious and exhausting experiences I've had with the game in a long time. While being super powerful and demolishing every enemy in your path can be kind of fun in a power fantasy sort of way, that quickly dulls as you're consistently one-shotting enemies over and over and over again. At a certain point, I was consistently dealing 4-digit damage to every enemy, Nothing stood a chance. Hell, there was one boss I dealt over 8,000 damage to. And these are supposed to be the harder fights. Monad doors are also a little too frequent in my opinion. Not only do they diminish the value of the stronger equipment since you can find them so often, but they also tend to add an extra 10 to 15 minutes to most floors that have them, mostly due to how spongy the enemies they have are. The bosses fall into a similar issue. None of them are particularly interesting in terms of moveset, but they all take ages to kill because they have tons of health. It sucks because there's one set of fights in the game that I think are actually really good, those being the fights against the rest of your party members near the end of the game. These 2-on-2 battles see your opponents use complementary skill sets that work in tandem with each other. For example, Yukari will use Ice Break to nullify any kind of ice resistance you might have, so that Mitsuru can then nuke you with an amped up ice spell. It's stuff like this that goes a long way to making a boss fight feel more dynamic, and it's the kind of stuff that I thought made the original answer pretty interesting. So it sucks that these kind of bosses are now the exception and not the rule. All of these issues culminate in a combat system that's extremely dumbed down compared to the previous games, and even the game it's based on. There's no reason that I should be able to comfortably play most of the game on autopilot on its highest difficulty. Even Akihiko thinks it was easy. Everything that was changed in the pursuit of modernization results in a game that takes away almost any opportunity for meaningful thought or decision making, and as a result trivializes and dumbs down the entire game. And unfortunately, it's not an issue that's exclusive to the gameplay side of things either. I mentioned before that the answer is a little contentious among the Persona fanbase, and a big part of that contention comes from the story. Leading up to the DLC's release, a couple of interviews came out discussing a few of the changes it would feature, and while I was expecting some adjustments to the story thanks to its reputation, the things they said about it definitely gave me pause. The most obvious addition is the inclusion of new hangout events for each of the party members. While I think these could potentially work on paper if done right, in execution I think they do more harm than good. The entire basis of this story is centered around how disconnected the party is after Makoto's death at the end of the main game. This is still noticeable in the main cutscenes, but it's thrown to the wayside as soon as you get these hangout events and have characters shooting the shit like they would in the main game. It creates this tonal whiplash that only gets worse as things get more and more tense between the party. The characters are constantly making it a point to tell you to keep exploring because it's imperative that the group finds a way to escape as quickly as possible, only for them to turn around and decide moments later to waste time watching a movie or doing a math workbook they found while exploring. Fuka baby, this isn't even your homework, why are you doing it? Even looking at these from purely a content perspective, I think they're pretty lacking. In the base game, these events were at least used to explore the character for people who are still getting to know them. But by this point, anyone playing this DLC is going to know who these characters are and what they're about. So instead of using these moments to explore how Makoto's death has affected them, their dynamic as a group, or what their mental state is like, instead they're being used to reiterate the exact stuff they've already been spewing over and over again in the base game. The only character that I think could have benefited from these is Metis, but the way they went about her events is so strange. There's one event that's similar to linked episodes in the base game, where you meet Metis in the mall and she talks about how inexperienced she is with normal life stuff. It looks like the event will have Aigis show Metis around the mall a little bit. It even gives you a choice on where to take her. But once you pick a location, the event just suddenly ends, and it's never followed up on either. There's another hangout near the end of the game where Metis fills out a list of her favorite things, but not only is it not related to the prior events in any way, it's not even voice acted like the last one. It feels like they were setting up a line of events where you get to do normal everyday stuff and see Metis' reaction to them, kinda like the Elizabeth hangouts in the main game. But nothing happens. It's so odd. It would have made sense to have Metis get more screen time and development devoted to her. And at times it feels like that was the plan, and then they just ran out of time or money or something. It's so strange. I'm not sure why they even bothered to begin with. At best, these extra hangout events feel like padding or just a means to re-unlock the characteristics, but at worst they actively conflict with the game's tone and add this weird disconnect to the game's plot. And unfortunately, this is something the main story itself is already suffering with. After fully exploring the Abyss of Time, the party is given a set of keys that can be used to either leave the dorm and return to the present, or go back in time and confront Nyx again in the hopes of changing the outcome. In order to use the keys, everyone in the group has to agree on how to use them. and this is where a lot of the contention comes from for both the characters and the fanbase. The group can't decide on how they want to proceed. Akihiko and Ken want to return to the present, because they believe Makoto sacrificed himself for a reason and want to respect his decision to do so. Meanwhile, Yukari wants to return to the past, since this is likely their only opportunity to try and save Makoto from his fate. Mitsuru decides to side with Yukari, since she wants to support her friend in her time of need, which just leaves Junpei, Fuka, Koromaru, and Aigis to make a decision. Junpei doesn't agree with either option despite seeing where they're coming from, and Aigis can't seem to pick one way or another. Aigis' reaction in particular sets off Yukari, as she interprets it as Aigis running away from the issue, since she was the only one to not come to Makoto's funeral, and she becomes even more hostile towards her because of it. The abyss of time is on the verge of collapsing, so since they can't decide on what they want to do, Yukari proposes they fight in order to decide who gets to use the keys. This is the basic chain of events that happens in both Fest and Reload. However, there's one major difference between the two, that being tone. Ignoring the tone conflict created by the Hangout events, even just looking at the two scenes side by side, it's clear that the Reload version is less heated. The characters now talk relatively calmly about their situation, preface their viewpoint by stressing it as their opinion or whatever, and I think this really hurts the climax of the story. The whole fighting your party members thing is already pretty contrived in both versions. I won't act like it isn't. However, I think it's more believable in the original due to how heated everyone is at that moment. Yukari especially is deeply affected by Makoto's death, so I don't think it's a huge jump that she'd want to go back and try to save him. It's clear through the cutscenes that Yukari is extremely jealous of Aigis getting Makoto's wildcard power and persona, and she internalizes it as Aigis getting something from him that the rest of the party didn't. The stress of the situation they're in, plus all of the negative emotions she's been holding in since Makoto's death, all explode at this moment, causing her to lash out at everyone who disagrees with her. It's an intentionally flawed response from an emotionally damaged character, so I don't think it's impossible to think she would make the jump to time to fight all my friends to get what she wants. This is even beautifully portrayed after you defeat her and Mitsuru and claim the true key, where even after losing, she quickly lashes out at Aigis and tries stealing the key before breaking down, finally taking the chance to grieve for Makoto's death. This last point isn't even present in Reload. It just skips to her breaking down right when she loses. Reload goes out of its way to tone down the motivations and feelings of all the characters in this scenario. They took the conflict out of the conflict. How the fuck do you even do that? By removing all of the angst, for the lack of a better word, it makes the irrationality of the whole thing all that more apparent. In Reload, it's as if they don't want any particular character to come off as rude or in the wrong, even though a clash of ideals is the entire point of this scenario. No one character is intended to be right. As a result, it's as if none of the parties feel strongly about their respective beliefs. I think Junpei suffers the most from this. In the Fest version, he clarifies why he feels the way he does, using his experience with Chidori's death to relate to both parties, on top of being scared of the outcome if they happen to lose to Nyx the second time around. But Reload boils it down to the point where it comes off as, I don't agree and I'm scared to fight Nyx, without any of the clarification. While it is technically the same reason, it doesn't feel as impactful without the clarification and relating it to an event we as an audience already know deeply affected Junpei. And as a result, I don't think it does a good job of distinguishing Junpei's decision from Aigis's. This toning down of character reactions makes it harder to believe that fighting was the only option here. Realistically, they could have taken an extra 5 or 10 minutes to talk it out and come to a similar conclusion to what they end up doing. But nah, we gotta waste that time watching a workout video with Fuka instead. The last thing I want to cover is the presentation, specifically the cutscenes. These feel so much flatter than their original counterparts. Like the story itself, a lot of these have been extremely dumbed down, to the point that some of them even give off a wrong impression of the events that are occurring. Like, look at the opening cutscene that has Aigis and Akihiko fighting in the arena. The original game has this intense flow to it. You can feel every impact and dodge. Despite lacking context, you can tell what's ever going on in this scenario is serious business, and the tension is super high. It feels like a real fight to the death, with each party member putting in their all to come out on top. Now look at Reload. Every movement feels extremely stiff and flat, and for some reason the blood that was present in the original cutscene is gone too. The same can be said about the scene where Metis is attacking the party in the dorm. The violence is either cut around or toned down, and the movements still feel extremely stiff. The last one I want to highlight is the one that plays after Shadow Makoto is defeated. In the original version, Shadow Makoto disappears in layers, and you can see his skeleton and organs as his body is fading away with this eerie droning in the background, intercut with shots of him smiling. It's honestly a beautiful scene. It's a fantastic way to sell how unsettling the whole scenario is for the characters, having to fight a shadow of someone they hold dear. And the shots of him smiling imply there might be a part of him still present in the Shadow version, and that he's happy they were able to overcome their ordeal. Now compare this to the Reload version, where he just stands there emotionless and disintegrates into dust, while Aigis does that hokey, "No, come back" motion. It's just so lame. All of the sauce in these cutscenes is just gone. I think a lot of it comes down to the lighting and shot composition in each scene. The ones in Fest tend to have these dark shadows and much more dynamic camera movements. We're constantly getting up close and personal with the characters during the action, which not only puts us right in the middle of it, but also adds to the intensity and sense of fluidity. The dark shadows help set an unsettling mood and hide the characters' expressions. In Reload's case, the lighting is extremely flat. It's as if everyone is being lit by one universal light source. The shot types are also far less interesting, mostly consisting of wide and full shots that let you see the entire character, which not only highlights their stiffness, but also takes away a bit of the tension and mystique that are crucial to these moments. Sorry, I let the film nerd part of me take over for a bit there, but hopefully you can see my point. I don't understand why we feel the need to constantly tone down more abstract or violent scenes like this. While you could argue the Shadow Makoto scene in the original is a little unnecessary, even though I disagree, I think the violence and blood and stuff does a great job of selling the mood the scene is trying to portray. Stuff like Akihiko barely dodging a bullet as it blasts through his sweat, or getting close up and personal with Ken as he's getting choked out by Metis goes a long way to raising the stakes in these scenes. Things have been so dumbed down in Reload to the point that some people playing it for the first time thought these characters were sparring instead of fighting to the death.
Whoa! Training or...
I'm guessing they're like training each other, they're not actually like fighting.
That kinda hurts me. They're in her training. Shooting your teammates is wild. What the heck kind of training is that?
Hey, yo, what are we doing? We sparring with each other? Jesus.
Wait, how the hell do we get here? What the fuck? Yo, who is this? Damn. Oh, they're training.
Right into something going down. Like Ken fighting ourselves, or maybe training. I'm not exactly sure what's going down.
I think if someone looks at a scene of your characters fighting to the death and just assumes they're sparring or something, that's a big red flag. No hate to these guys, by the way. I'm just trying to showcase how poor the new directing is. It's not like the amount of blood or violence in the original is that excessive to begin with. And besides, this game is rated M. Why are we treating the audience like they're a bunch of babies? Anyone playing this game is more than capable of critical thinking and interpretation, so I don't understand the need to constantly dumb it down to this point. This was a problem in the base game's cutscenes too, but I think here in the DLC it's much more egregious, since in a lot of cases it fundamentally changes how these scenes are portrayed and actively hurts their effectiveness. So in conclusion, would I recommend this version of the answer? It's kinda hard for me to say, really. I know a lot of people are upset that this was paid post-launch DLC, but on paper I think that was actually the right call. After reading some post-launch interviews, it's clear that this expansion wasn't going to be in the cards for the main game, and it only went into production summer of last year thanks to all of the fan outcry of it not being there. So in that sense, I think it's fair for them to charge money for it since it was out of the scope of the original project and required more time and money to even make. Plus, even looking at it from an optics perspective, I think releasing it a few months after the base game was a smart move. Reload is primarily targeted at people who haven't played the base game, and I think asking them to sink 70 plus hours into the main game and then immediately jump into a more combat-focused epilogue would have been asking a little too much for most people to handle. Giving the average consumer a few months to decompress before going back in gives them a better chance of going into the game with an open mind and enjoying it more. Now that being said, what I can't give a pass is this game's pricing structure. This DLC expansion pass isn't the only DLC available for the game. The game actually launched with another set of DLC costumes, personas, and music packs. This structure is not new for Atlus stuff. A lot of their games launch with tons of DLC. But the issue is that this second DLC expansion wasn't announced until a little after a month post-release. They obviously knew this thing was in development before the game launched, so I think it's kinda scummy to hide that fact and not include it in deluxe editions and stuff, so that people will buy them or the DLC separately just to pull the rug out from under them with more paid DLC. Then you get to the price of the expansion pass. This shit is $35. It comes with 2 sets of costumes and episode Aigis. Personally, I don't think the expansion is worth any more than $20, and these 2 costume sets are sure as hell not worth $15 on their own. If it were me, I would have made only one DLC pass that includes everything. All of the costumes, personas, music packs, on top of the DLC expansion, and not priced it any more than $30. As it stands now though, you have to spend over $100 to get the full Persona 3 experience. And if you were one of the people that bought the deluxe edition because you thought it came with all the content, you have to pay even more than that. It's ridiculous, and I really hope that Atlus learns from all the backlash and prices their DLC better going forward. At the end of the day, episode Aigis is more Persona 3 Reload, so if you like the base game, you'll more than likely get something out of this. For me though, I had a really hard time getting through this one. If I wasn't already committed to making a video thanks to getting a review code, thank you Atlus by the way, I probably would have dropped it after block 3 or 4. The game embodies a lot of what I think Reload does wrong as a remake. It dumbs down the experience to a mind-numbing degree, both in terms of gameplay and presentation. The game balance is somehow worse than it was in the base game, because they hand you pretty much all of the broken abilities for free, and as a result nothing really stands a chance. Every upgrade the player is presented with introduces a new way to skip or trivialize parts of the pre-established gameplay loop, instead of offering new ways to interact with it. The new additions to the story, such as the hangout events, create this tonal whiplash that in tandem with the dumbed-down character motivations result in a less impactful story overall. That's not to say there's nothing I like about this DLC. The environments look quite nice. I really dig this castle aesthetic, for example. The siege fights at the end were a glimpse of what a more balanced and interesting game could look like, and I really like the new battle theme a lot. More like, don't make me play any more of this game, ayo! All of these things culminate in an experience that bores me to tears, and there was very little I could find enjoyment in during my 35 hours of playtime. But if you were able to find more enjoyment in the game than I was, then that's okay too. I talked about this a little bit in my remakes versus criticism video, but the discourse and vitriol around this game in particular has been crazy overblown. I see a lot of people write off any and all criticisms of this version as nostalgia blindness or rose-tinted opinions, which I just don't understand. It doesn't take a genius to notice that there's a lot of differences between both versions of the game. I mean hell, one of the biggest talking points is that Reload is objectively better because it doesn't have the AI-controlled party. Normally I'm all for fostering different interpretations of art and all that. I mean I love the recent Resident Evil 4 remake for that reason. But at the end of the day, this game is being sold as the definitive version of Persona 3. And whether or not you like some or all of the changes present, the fact is they fundamentally change the way the game and story is experienced. In a lot of ways, this game just isn't Persona 3. And for some people that's a bad thing, because it's being sold as a definitive, faithful remake. And unlike Resident Evil 4, Reload is the only way to experience Persona 3 on modern hardware, unless you want to play the scuffed port of Portable or something. That doesn't mean you still can't enjoy the game. God knows I still enjoy remakes that people consider inferior. But writing off other people's opinions because they don't like it for some of the stuff it does differently is just silly. It's just as valid to like Reload for the pretty graphics and new voice cast, as it is to like the original for its deeper combat loop and more nuanced storytelling. It's still important to have these conversations about the differences between the versions and the effects they have on the overall product, but just because someone prefers a different version than you doesn't mean their opinion is any less valid, or make them a grifter or a hater or whatever you want to call them. While I fall into the camp that doesn't like Reload all that much, I can see why someone would prefer this version, especially if they didn't play the original. And honestly, more power to them. It means they didn't blow $70 on a game they didn't end up liking. I just hate this constant loop of hating on people for preferring a different version of a game. It's not like the people who don't like it are saying you have to hate it because they do. They're just sharing their opinion and explaining why they feel the way they do. While yes, some people take it too far, The vast majority of hate I see is directed towards people that are just trying to have a conversation. Them not liking it doesn't make your enjoyment any less valid. They're still allowed to convey why they don't like it, and if you don't agree, that's great. Just keep enjoying the game and move on. Video games as a medium are inherently subjective, so there's no reason to attack people for having either opinion. And it's honestly really embarrassing when I see dogpiling on either side. It makes us look like a bunch of children. We need to do better. Episode Aigis may not have been the answer I wanted, but regardless, I'm glad that someone out there is able to see something in it that I don't. And maybe if we can start having civil discussions about these things, instead of dogpiling on whatever this week's punching bag is, we can all come to some better answers of our own.